pleasure to be here to share what I have done in the past few years, what I'm doing here in Vermont, and tell you what I'm passionate about, and hopefully start collaborating with people here at the Gun Institute. So a little bit of like the introduction also that Ara gave. I wanted to talk, share a little bit my path with you. As you notice, I have a thick accent. I'm from Argentina, from Patagonia, right here. I did my undergrad there, but then came to the US for some work and grad school, spent some time in Canada too as a postdoc, and then went back to Argentina where I took a research position and also a faculty position at the same university where I did my undergrad, which was good, was amazing actually to come back as in a different role. But then in a crazy turn of events, we decided to relocate again to the US, to this part of the US in Vermont. We really like it here. And even though you might not think that's the case, this place reminds us a lot of home. This is Bariloche, our hometown down in Patagonia. And of course, the Andes are way higher. But you can see the town is by the shores of a lake. And we enjoy a lot the outdoors. So we really like it here. When people ask me, so what do you do, who you are, I say, I'm a field ecologist. So that's the first thing I say, right? Because nowadays people can do ecology in so many ways. But I like spending time in that field, measuring plants and counting animals and digging soil. Actually, I do a lot of soil sampling. Here you can see me taking some measurements on plant communities with a postdoctoral researcher, Luciana. I'm going to talk about her work later on today. These are warming temperatures, and we were looking at how plant communities were responding to increasing temperatures down there in Patagonia. We replicated this experiment actually in low elevations and high elevations. So I do work with a variety of drivers of global change, but honestly, my main focus in my whole career has been a lot on invasive species, and today I'm going to focus on that. So my research, today I split the talk in three main research questions that I work on. The first one is how do invasive species alter native communities and ecosystem structure and function. So a lot of fun on the ecological impacts. But then more recently, I started exploring these socio-economical dimensions of invasive species. This is a whole new area for me. I'm not an expert on that, and I rely a lot on collaborators, but I'll tell you more on what I'm doing on that subject, and then how we can effectively manage invasive species. So to take you in these questions, I first wanted to review a few concepts, and those of my students will recognize these slides, but the audience is broader here. So a native species is different from an introduced species in that a native species is one that naturally occurs in a location. In contrast to that, we have some introduced or exotic or non-native species. Those terms are used interchangeably to identify organisms that have been transported by humans from their native range into a new location. And those transportations can happen by accident or intentionally. But it's always mediated by human activities. And this is what I want to stress, because nowadays we see species that are expanding their ranges due to different reasons. And invasion ecologists usually focus on those that are assisted by humans rather than like natural range expansion, as we see in other species. Now, there are a lot of species that we move around for different reasons. Some because we like to grow in our backyards. We like to have as pets or exotic animals. And then some because we grow as crops. And again, invasion ecologists are not worried about any of these species because all of these mostly rely on humans for subsistence actually, and water or nutrients, and so they don't cause any environmental problem most of the cases. But then there is a really small proportion of these introduced species that we move that become invasive species and are problematic. And so the definition for invasive species is are introduced species that sustain growing population sizes that affect or harm the environment, the economy, and health. And I want to stress that it is really a small portion of all the species that we move around. It is estimated that only about 1% of all the species that we move become invasive and problematic. And I want to highlight here the main traits of an invasive species. We see sustaining growing populations and impact on the economy, health, and the environment, of course. And I'm gonna walk you through this with a few examples here in both in the US, but also in Argentina. And I'm going backwards or not? Okay. So here I have two well-known examples of what do we mean when we say growing populations. Over here, I would ask my students to say which species these are. But over here, you can see Katsu, which is a species that was introduced intentionally in the US to do soil erosion control, to fix erosion issues around road construction. And then, as you can clearly see on this picture, it went out of whack and it grows all over the place. It's a big issue in the southeast of the US. They grow on top of any living plants and trees, they knock them down, even on infrastructure. So big issue in the southeast of the US. And then over here, down there, you can see another well-known invasive species in this area. That's zebra mussel. It was introduced in the US by accident, very different than this one. It came in ballast water in cargo ships. When we move things across continents, the ships need sometimes to take water from different ports to balance the weights and like afford the travel across the seas. And then they used to dump the water in the new port. And that's how we move a lot of aquatic species across different continents. So that's one species that came over here. Both of these, as you can see, their populations are over the roof. So they displace native species. They compete for resources, nutrients in areas, affecting this structure of the native communities, but also altering ecosystem processes. In lakes, for example, where zebra mussel is really abundant, they change completely nutrient dynamics, even water turbidity. The Great Lakes change, you can see a change in images in water turbidity just because after the invasion of zebra mussel, which is amazing to think that they can alter such a large body of water. So for this reason, with these few other examples that I'm showing here, the invasive species right now are considered the second biggest threat to biodiversity. And again, here I'm compiling several well-known invasive species that occur in the US in different areas, European chattree, cheatgrass, European starling. I wanted to point out though that people here value a lot beavers. The beavers in Patagonia were introduced. Yeah, we love beavers. I do love them. But in Patagonia, we hate them because they were introduced. Our forests are not adapted to such a disturbance. We don't have any equivalent to beavers in Patagonia. So it's very interesting now that I relocated to, the northern latitudes, see that people is putting a lot of effort in conserving or bringing back the beavers. And I'm coming from this perspective where we want to kill all the beavers. Anyway, so going back to my main research questions, the first one was about what are the impacts of invasive species on native communities and ecosystems. And I wanted to focus on wild boar, which is a species that I've been studying for like 20 years almost. I started with that when I did my PhD. So wild boar are native to Europe and Asia and Northern Africa, on the black part of this map. So you can see they have a really wide range in the natural range. And then it was introduced all over the world actually, and all these oceanic islands where you see a circle. It was moved by explorers on purpose. European explorers brought them as a food resource, right? They didn't know what they're gonna find. So they released a bunch of mammals, actually, not only wild boar, but goats and rabbits and rats. They all came in the ship. And that's why we see them everywhere. So really widespread currently in all the continents. This species is a very successful invasive species because it has so many traits that makes it a good invasive species. First off, it reproduces a lot. It can have litters of like 16 individuals, 16 piglets, and in warm areas, it can reproduce twice a year. So it really is best in that sense. It also eats a lot. It has a really wide diet. It's an omnivore species. It feeds both on plants and animals, mostly plants actually. The diet is 90% plant material. Occasionally they prey in some animals, as you can see in this figure, but also when all the resources are limited above ground, wild boars can overturn the soil. They use their tusk and overturn the soil to feed on roots and soil organisms like earthworms and fungi. So they create these they destroy basically, turn apart large areas of vegetation. And this is what you see, this picture I took in Patagonia. It's very common. These systems are known as machines. They are a type of wetland. Not necessarily they get underwater, but they are super wet and productive. I'm gonna talk about these systems later on in my presentations, but they are very important for rural communities. So wild boar in Argentina, it was introduced in Buenos Aires, in this part of the country, in the 1500s by the European explorers. And since then, it has been spreading northwards and southwards. And honestly, this map we put together 2 years ago with a lot of collaborators, but we know there are isolated populations in all the extremes, and we suspect that eventually it will cover the whole territory of Argentina. It doesn't like high elevation, so probably won't go all the way up in the Andes, but all the flat areas is expected that it will adapt. So during my PhD and postdoctoral work, I explore all these dimensions of how it affects ecosystems, native ecosystems. I focused on impacts on plant communities, where they were facilitating plant invasion or altering ecosystem processes such as decomposition rate and nutrient cycling. I also explore effects on soil communities. To address these questions, I set up an exclosure experiment. We built around 30 of these exclosures in Patagonia in different plant communities. I set these exclosures up in an island actually, where there was no wild boar, and the boar has colonized the area only like 5 years before I set up the experiment, so there was very little damage. I set up these exclosures in areas where there was no evidence of activity, and through time, fortunately, within my years of the PhD, we saw a lot of disturbance, and as you can clearly see on this picture, and a lot of my thesis and my postdoctoral work was basically comparing what was happening inside and outside these exclosures. So going back to the questions, when I was looking at changes on plant communities, I harvested plant biomass, I looked at species composition and found big changes in species that were occurring both inside and outside. The case was like wild boars, as you saw in that picture, was reducing what was growing there, as you would expect, and changing the community composition. I did see that in some areas, some invasive species were growing well, which motivated my second question on how they were promoting further invasion. And I did a few experiments to test very different mechanisms for that, but found basically that the rooting disturbance removes native plant cover, and then that becomes a suitable spot for invasive species to grow. They did much better growing in those disturbed areas outside the exclosure Then inside the disclosure, I compared biomass and height and like a few metrics, and plus plants, of course, thrive in that disturbed areas. And then I switched to look at this because they affect the soil. I was interested in exploring ecosystem effects. So I set up a decomposition experiment and collected soils and measured nutrients. And I found that they decreased decomposition rates of organic matter if I compared inside and outside, which was kind of surprising. As I expected, like higher activity outside. But I'll tell you more after. And then I found no effect on soil nutrients, which was also surprising to me. We think that as I did this work in a volcanic area, and the soils there are very weird, distinct in some way, and they might not respond as much as to soil disturbance, and so we didn't observe as much changes in nutrient availability. But I was intrigued by that change of how they affecting the composition rates. And so for my postdoctoral work, I dig deeper in that and look at changes in the soil community, and found that they decrease the soil disturbance, decrease soil respiration rates. That means microbial activity in the soil. And also it altered the soil arthropod richness and abundance. So the decomposers of the soils were both the microbial community and the arthropod community were negatively impacted by the disturbance, and that's why I found this decrease in decomposition rates. So very wide, as you can see, very wide impacts on the plant community, but also on the ecosystem structure and function. This is another picture from another exclosure that I had down there. But that was not it. When I was doing this work, there were other people working in the area. And of course, there is more than one single invasive species occurring in a given place at a given time. And that's the case for my study site, where there are also pines. And these invasive introduced pines were brought there for forestry purposes. They provide a good source of like quick wood there for construction. But these pines relied on endomycorrhiza fungi. As you can see in that picture, these truffles, they only grow underground. And because there were no native dispersers of that fungi, the pines were really limited in their distribution. Now, a friend of mine was doing that research, understanding the pine invasion dynamic over there. And together we thought, well, maybe the wild boars will change the dynamics here because they disturb the soil and they feed on fungi. So sure enough, we decided to collect some droppings and set up some greenhouse experiments. And we did find that wild boars are eating on. I collected droppings to test this. That's the only way you can do that, right? But yeah, we collected droppings and grew the pine seedlings with the droppings and found that the wild boars are feeding on the fungi and are dispersing the spores of these endomycorrhiza fungi, which in turn then facilitate invasion by pines. So things might really change over there now that we have this interactive invasive species. So now this is an indirect effect that wild boar has on pine invasion, and it's well known in the field as something called invasional meltdown, which means that one invasive species is aiding or facilitating invasion by another. In this case, wild boars get a nice source of food, and then at the same time, pines get benefited from the dispersal of the symbiote that help them grow and thrive over there. So anyways, it's like, oh, there is so much. And then I met Luciana. Luciana is a postdoc who her field of expertise was very different. She was interested in aquatic communities in wetlands in Patagonia. And when she was doing her PhD work, she noticed that some of the wetlands she was working in were affected by wild boar disturbance. And so for her postdoc, she came to me and Mariano, actually, we both advised her, and we thought about trying to understand what is the impact of all these ungulates on aquatic communities. So she set up camera traps around like 16 or 17 wetlands down in Patagonia in a national park. And then she was like curious to see, oh, how many ungulates or introduced mammals are using these places. And we found a bigger range of animals. There's also cattle and horses that rural communities use a lot, and it's common to have roaming down in the forest over there. So when she looked at the data coming up from the camera traps, here I'm plotting what we found. She found that some wetlands have no activity at all of any invasive ungulate, but some wetlands have not only one, but maybe two of those invasive ungulates, a combination between cattle and horse or just wild boars. And then some wetlands have a lot of activity of all of these invasive ungulates, like the 3 species, and there was a lot of disturbance. And so she went out to the field, and once with this information, she wanted to look at the changes in aquatic communities, and she found big dramatic changes too. There was changes in vegetation, plant height, and plant cover was very different in these wetlands, but that cascaded into the aquatic system. So she found changes in the like flies and worms. I'm going to translate these to common names, but also dragonflies. So dragonflies lay their eggs on tall vegetation, and because the wild boar and all the ungulates were removing vegetation, there were much less dragonflies, which are top predators in these systems, in these areas. So she proved that there are these cross-ecosystem effects of invasive species, right? We usually study terrestrial systems very separate from the aquatic systems, but we could see here these cascading effects between these ecosystem boundaries. So that's a lot of environmental impacts, but I said that invasive species are not only an environmental impact, they also cause harm on the economy and health. And so this brings me to my second point of my talk today, which are like, what are the social economical dimension of invasive species? And here on the right, I'm showing a picture of pines that are spreading in Patagonia. And this is a tough question to answer, because even though ecologists might be, 100% agree that invasive species are a problem, many invasive species also represent a source of food or a source of income. So dealing with these socio-economic dimensions of invasive species is complicated. We not all agree on what we need to do on these issues. So it is estimated right now that the cost of invasive species, it's growing like 4 times every decade in the past 50 years. And right now it's estimated to be around $423 billion annually, just in cost of like managing damage and controlling their populations. This data came from the IPBES report released in 2023. IPBES is the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which compiles a lot of information globally on many environmental issues, but one of them is invasive species. Specifically thinking about wild boar, as I've been talking a lot about the species, this data comes from the US. It is estimated that the wild boars cost $1.5 billion in damage every year. And then there's another 30 million spent in controlling, as you clearly can see in this picture. It not only affects natural native habitats and ecosystems, but also crops. This data comes from Georgia. It's outdated though. I would like to see newer data on this, but these are the crops that are reported to have suffered damage by wild boar. You can see it affected a wide variety of crops. They particularly seem to like peanuts. But I've read things even affecting forestry too. I mean, yeah, all over the place. On top of that, wild boar hosts a whole range of like, I think it's like 32 pathogens or diseases that affect both farm animals and humans too, farm animals and humans. So a very big issue we've seen especially in China, there was an outbreak of swine fever a few years ago that the Chinese government actually had to slaughter like a third of the whole like country pork production. It's insane and how things can become really complicated when we're thinking about disease. But I wanted to, when thinking about these socioeconomic impacts, I wanted to share a little bit of what I'm doing right now. On to the team now is also Victoria Rojo. She did the undergrad with me thesis, and now she's doing her PhD. And her thesis is focusing on how wild boar is impacting on livestock ranching, mostly sheep ranching down in Patagonia. So I'm going back to the machines, these wetlands that I mentioned earlier in the talk. The steppe in Patagonia is super dry, or the forest is super close, and it's really hard to do any of these farming activities. But these meadow-like wetland systems so become really, really important for rural communities and ranchers over there. So most of the ranching is sheep ranching. And as you can see here, these are areas that are, because of the micro topography, they have higher water content and they are become way more productive. We have a lot of foliage here that is pastures that are good for ranching. But now we have wild boar in the system. So you can see in this picture how, you know, there comes a group of animals and they remove everything. And this clearly affects pasture productivity. And for the ranchers, it becomes really important because they cannot sustain their herds. So in the past few years, Vicky has been working there. Also another colleague, we set up another experiment to measure how this is impacting sheep ranching in Patagonia. So her thesis is focusing on how aspects of that are more ecological, how wild boar is affecting plant productivity in these meadows, whether wild boar is also attracting some native predators because they reproduce a lot. There has been some records that predators, you know, will become more abundant or active in areas where they are present. So we're hoping to connect and see whether we see a correlation between abundance of wild boar and predators and how that is affecting sheep ranching in Patagonia. She's also doing several interviews to talk about surveys, to talk with local ranchers and learn from them whether they see this more like as a threat to their livelihoods, the way they are living and producing, sustaining their sheep systems, or this is another, you know, becomes a source of food or income. Honestly, the first few data that we have right now, they see it more as a problem, especially because they host disease. And ranchers cannot even eat the meat without testing it. So it's really complicated to have them there. But this is her second year in the PhD, so we still don't have that much data to share with you today. I do want to now switch to management, and that's why we also talk to people, because most people is like, so what do we do, right? A lot of like, my research is like, you know a lot about the impacts and so on, but like, what do we do? And so before I get into this, I wanted to show you here like the invasion process a little bit and discuss that, like, because management options change a lot depending on the invasion stage that you are. So in this figure, we have time here on the x-axis and the area impacted by an invasive species. And so we want to, actually, ideally, we don't want any invasive species, right? We don't have to deal with this. And so there are some things that we can do to prevent that from happening. But once a species is introduced, there is a lag phase in which it's hard to detect the species because the number of individuals are so small. That it's hard to tell whether they are there or not. But as time goes by, their populations start establishing and spreading and then becoming widespread. And so management strategies change a lot depending on the stage of the invasion where you are. So in early stage, if there is no invasions, you want to work a lot on prevention and being ready in case the species come. But then once the species is there, things like early detection are very important, and also acting very quickly. I don't think it too much. Eradicate, go remove every single individual if you can, as fast as you can. But then once this threshold is passed, then you start like working on like bigger areas. You switch management efforts into containment or control and restoration depending on the abundance. And if you use any of these, then you might tweak the line here of the abundance or the impacted area curve and get it smaller. Okay, now I want to note here that as time goes by also, the efficiency of management, it's really small, right? The strategies, again, change a lot. We hear you never aim to eradicate the species from an area where it's widespread, and you focus on conservation priority areas. You focus on preventing the spread only at the invasion front, that's all. And also, as time goes by, the cost, the economic impact of the species increase a lot because they are widespread, because they cause damage, and also because you have to now add money into controlling the species. So that's why always early prevention, early detection is way more important to invest there than to get all the way to the end. Okay, a few more things. Managing pathways or species is the first target. And then as you move here, then you work at the site level or ecosystem level or catchment. And this actually links to my next case study, which is Japanese knotweed. So Japanese knotweed it's a native, as you can see here, it forms these very thick areas of vegetation where nothing else can grow. It is native to East Asia, Japan, Korea, and China, and it was introduced in Europe and in the US. Now we see some small populations here, and then in Chile there are a few there, but I'm hoping they will make it disappear before it becomes widespread too. It was introduced on an ornamental plant on people's backyards. It's crazy. But it was its own introduction. It's like the ends of the 1800s. People didn't know them. And it became widespread, a very big issue. In Europe, they have several species actually that are hybridizing. Here we have also two that are also hybridizing too. So it makes it more challenging to deal with them. But yeah, they form these very thick areas of vegetation. It loves riparian areas. So it's very common to see along rivers and lake shores and wetland systems. The plant has a really thick rhizome system, but it's pretty shallow. It doesn't go that much down in the soil. And then in wintertime, it dies off and it survives only through that rhizome system and regrow every year. But so also, as you can see in this picture, as it dies, it increases a lot in soil erosion around rivers and lakes. And this is the main concern of these invasive species in the area, because as we see increasing flooding events here, invasive species like Japanese knotweed is also reducing or decreasing flooding resilience in some of our communities. This photo is actually from the Mud River Valley, the project that I'm gonna talk about right now from 2023. So this is an incredible effort, honestly, that I'm really happy to now be part of. It started back in 2019, and I just joined this past year to it. But it's a 3-city effort or town effort. Now, the towns of Warren, Waitsfield, and Faceton have united efforts to get rid of the Japanese knowledge in the Mud River Valley. And their effort is truly amazing in that there is a lot of like community engagement there, a lot of efforts in education, but also what I love from these people is that they are working at the watershed level. So remember when I was describing what do you do with an invasive species that is really spread out, it's really hard to control, except that you work on like units in the like landscape, right? And a watershed here we might enable them to be successful there. They really want to get rid of this. So in these past few years, they have mapped the occurrence of every single patch of the plant. So the plant only reproduces vegetatively, which actually it's amazing because like we don't have birds or the wind dispersing seeds. And that's why people feel very confident there that they can really get rid of this plant. And so they have mapped every single patch. And for the past like 6 years or so, they've been going through every single patch of it, and they've been managing in different ways. So they dig the roots out, they pull, they cut, they do a smothering, which means that they are covering the plants with a thick plastic for 1 or 2 years, and then the plants die out because they don't have resources. This year, they even had goats. They thought, herbivory is a way of controlling invasive plants. It was interesting. They love it. It's also challenging managing a herd of goats, and also because the Japanese knotweed is not very nutritious, so they had to supplement their diet. But interesting methods that are being used. When we do management of invasive species, it is the case that people use multiple management tools. So it is perfect that they are actually approaching this in different ways. Here you can see a picture of them working also. Here's Kurt, who is the conservation, he belongs to the Conservation Commission of Waitsfield. And they are hiring actually a bunch of UVM students. I don't know if any of you have done this already, but they hired about 7 interns every summer to help them actually do a lot of the field work of removing species. And they also do some restoration practices. So they have been planting willows and cottonwoods in the areas that they are clearing. The good news is that they have been returning to some of the patches and they started to collect some data. So I joined the project to help them systemize the effort, but also collect data to understand which methods are more successful. And they found so far that in some of the plots, they see a reduction of the stem number per meter square, or like 15% reduction. Also, they are getting smaller. This repeated management of the plants is kind of like weakening the plants, and so they don't grow back as much as they would, without human intervention. Here you can see a few comparisons of like pre-post management of some of the sites where they are working. Is really impressive. But it's true, the management here, they don't want to do any chemical control either. It's only manual mechanical removal. So they need to sustain it through time to be successful. And importantly, they do a lot of education They set up this booth during farmer market, and they have a lot of involvement from the community, which is actually key to have to get successful management of invasive species. So I don't know, I cannot tell you whether this effort will be hopefully another success story in managing invasive species. I'm working with the data. We hope that in the next few years, we will have more clear data on this. But I did got really moved by the effort of the community. This all started in the community, and they reached out to UVM for interns and for researchers to help them guide their management efforts. And I love their passion. You know, it's really moving to see them work over there. And with that, that's all I have. I'll take questions.